My name is Emily Carter, and for most of my life I believed I was my parents' second choice. Not in the obvious movie drama kind of way. They never forgot my birthday. They never screamed that they wished they'd had a different daughter. They never outright said my brother mattered more. If anything, they did everything parents are supposed to do. They packed my lunches, came to school plays, helped with homework, bought me Christmas presents, told me they loved me, and somehow, that almost made it worse. Because if they had been openly cruel, openly neglectful, openly unfair, then at least I would have had something solid to point to. Something undeniable. Instead, what I had were moments. Tiny moments. Quiet moments. The kind of moments that, on their own, meant nothing. But stacked together over years, they built a story. A story I told myself so many times that eventually it stopped feeling like an assumption and became an absolute truth. My brother mattered more. And no matter how hard I worked, no matter what I accomplished, no matter how perfect I tried to become, I would never matter the same way he did. For years, that belief shaped everything about who I became. It drove me harder, made me colder, turned every achievement into a desperate, silent plea for approval. And by the time I was 22, I had convinced myself that the only way to finally prove my worth was to build a life so extraordinary that my parents would one day realize what they had overlooked. Then the world shut down. I found myself stranded thousands of miles from home, completely alone in a foreign country. And when everything I had built started collapsing around me, the people I thought had never truly chosen me moved heaven and earth to save my life. What I discovered after that changed everything. But to understand how badly I misunderstood my family, you need to understand where it all began. I was 8 years old the first time I remember feeling it. That strange ache. That first sharp sting of being overlooked. It was a Thursday afternoon. I remember that because Thursdays were spelling test days in 3rd grade. And that day, for the first time all year, I got a perfect score. 100%. Mrs. Henderson had drawn a giant gold star across the top of the page and written, "Excellent work, Emily." To most adults, that probably sounds painfully insignificant. But when you're 8, moments like that feel enormous. That little paper felt like proof. Proof that I was smart. Proof that I was doing something right. Proof that maybe, just maybe, I could make my parents proud enough for them to really notice me. I spent the entire bus ride home imagining how my mom would smile when I showed her. I even practiced how I'd hand it to her. Casual. Like it wasn't a big deal. Even though it absolutely was. When I walked through the front door, the house smelled like tomato soup. My mom was in the kitchen standing at the stove. I remember the sunlight coming through the window behind her, making everything feel warm and golden. It should have been a perfect memory. "Mom," I said, breathless with excitement. She turned and smiled. "Hey, sweetheart." I held out the paper. "Look what I got." She reached for it. And then the phone rang. I can still hear that ringtone. That old shrill landline ring that somehow always sounded urgent. She glanced at the caller ID. Her expression changed instantly. The smile disappeared. Concern replaced it. She picked up. "Hello." There was a pause. Then, "Oh my God." I remember the exact way my stomach dropped. Even before I knew what had happened, I knew. It was always Jason. My brother had gotten into trouble at school. This time he'd been caught stealing Pokemon cards from another kid's backpack. My mom hung up, rushed to grab her purse, and was halfway out the door before she looked back at me. "Put your test on the fridge, okay? I'll look at it later." And then she was gone. That paper stayed on the fridge for 13 days. I counted. At first, every time she walked into the kitchen, I'd glance at it hopefully. Maybe now. Maybe she'd notice. Maybe she'd finally say something. But she never did. Eventually the corners curled. The gold star faded slightly. And one night, after everyone had gone to bed, I quietly took it down and threw it away. I cried while I did it. Not because of the test. But because even at 8 years old I understood what it meant. Jason had needed attention. And that meant there was none left for me. My brother Jason was 3 years older than me. And if we had been characters in a novel, our personalities would have felt embarrassingly cliché. I was quiet. Careful. Responsible. The kind of kid who color-coded her school folders and cried if she got a B. Jason was chaos in human form. Loud. Funny. Restless. Impulsive. The kind of person who could walk into any room and instantly become the center of it. People loved him. Teachers noticed him. Kids gravitated toward him. Even when he was causing problems, he was impossible to ignore. Especially when he was causing problems. And he always was. By the time he was 12, there was already a pattern. Missed assignments. Detentions. Arguments with teachers. Sneaking out. Lying. Nothing catastrophic at first. Just enough to keep my parents in a constant state of stress. I didn't understand that then. All I understood was attention. And where it seemed to go. Every week there was some new emergency. Some new conversation. Some new consequence. Family meetings. Long discussions. Raised voices behind closed doors. My parents endlessly trying to figure out what was going on with Jason. Meanwhile, I was over in the corner doing homework and getting straight A's. Invisible because I wasn't a problem. At least that's how it felt. By age 10, I had already made a decision I couldn't have articulated at the time. Jason got attention by being difficult. I would get attention by being perfect. So I became obsessed with achievement. Not because I loved it. Not at first. Because I thought excellence was my only path to being seen. I studied harder than anyone in my class. Practiced piano until my fingers cramped. Ran laps until I nearly threw up. Volunteered for everything. Every science fair. Every student council project. Every extracurricular opportunity. And every accomplishment carried the same private hope. This one will be enough. This one will make them look at me the way they look at him. I still remember winning my first elementary school track ribbon. Second place in the 400-meter dash. I was 11. I wore that ribbon all the way home. I imagined my dad putting it on the mantle. Telling people about it. Looking proud. When I got home, he was on the phone with Jason's principal. Apparently my brother had gotten suspended for fighting. I stood in the doorway holding that ribbon for nearly 5 minutes while my dad paced the kitchen. He was too distracted to notice. Finally, I just went upstairs. I pinned it to my corkboard myself. That corkboard became my private shrine. Ribbons. Certificates. Boards. Evidence. If no one else was going to celebrate my accomplishments, I would. Still, every new addition carried a little less excitement than the last. Because deep down I was starting to suspect the truth. No achievement would ever compete with a crisis. And Jason was an endless supply of crises. Things got worse when we reached high school. That's when the drugs started. Though I didn't know how serious it was at the time. I just knew my brother changed. He became unpredictable. Sometimes charming and energetic. Other times withdrawn and furious. He skipped school constantly. Started disappearing for hours. Then days. Our parents fought about him all the time. The whole house felt tense. Like we were all walking around on glass. And somehow, even in the middle of all that, I kept pushing myself harder. Straight A's. Varsity track. Student government. National Honor Society. Part-time job at a bookstore. I was exhausted all the time. But I couldn't stop. Because if I stopped achieving, what was left? Who was I if not the good child? It wasn't just ambition anymore. It was identity. And every success still felt hollow. Because no matter what I accomplished, Jason always managed to pull focus back to himself. Always. The moment that solidified everything happened on my 15th birthday. I'd planned that party for months. Nothing extravagant. Just 6 close friends. Pizza. Movies. Sleepover. Normal teenage stuff. I was excited in that restrained way high-achieving kids often are. Pretending not to care too much because caring too much feels embarrassing. That morning I came downstairs to balloons. My mom had baked my favorite chocolate cake. My dad gave me a card with $50 tucked inside. For a moment it felt perfect. Then Jason got arrested. Possession. Weed mostly. Small enough that legally it wasn't a huge deal. Big enough to send my parents into full panic mode. The party was cancelled within an hour. My friends texted asking what happened. I lied. Family emergency. I spent the evening alone in my room while my parents dealt with police paperwork and picked my brother up. No cake. No movie night. No laughter downstairs. Just silence. And somewhere around 11 p.m. I heard the front door open. Voices. My mother crying. My father speaking in that tight, controlled voice he used when he was furious. Jason mumbling apologies. And sitting there in the dark, still wearing the sweater I'd picked out for my party, I thought. Of course this happened. Because even on my birthday he mattered more. That was the night resentment hardened into certainty. Not suspicion. Not insecurity. Certainty. I stopped wondering whether my parents favored him. I knew they did. Or at least I thought I did. And that belief shaped every major decision I made after that. Including the one that would eventually take me thousands of miles away from all of them. But before I left, there was one more moment. One moment I carried like proof for years. And looking back now, it's the memory that hurts the most. Because I understand it so differently now. That moment came the day I got accepted into college. The email arrived at 3:17 in the afternoon. I remember because I stared at the timestamp for nearly a full minute before I opened it. By then, I had refreshed my inbox so many times over the previous week that my laptop trackpad was starting to feel warm under my fingers. Northwestern had been my dream school for years. Not just because of the prestige. Not just because of the nearly impossible acceptance rate. But because to me it represented escape. A clean break. Proof that everything I had sacrificed, every missed party, every late-night study session, every weekend spent working instead of relaxing, had meant something. When I saw the subject line, my entire body went cold. Your Northwestern University admissions decision. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely click. And then I saw it. Congratulations. For a second I genuinely forgot how to breathe. I just stared. Reading the same sentence over and over again. I had gotten in. Not only that, I'd received an academic scholarship package so substantial that my parents would barely have to contribute. It was everything I had worked for. Everything. I screamed so loudly that my mom came running upstairs. What happened? I turned the laptop toward her. And for one glorious moment, everything was exactly how I had always imagined. Her eyes widened, then filled with tears. Oh my God. She threw her arms around me. My dad came barreling up the stairs after hearing the commotion. When he saw the screen, his entire face lit up. I had never seen him smile that widely. Emily. He hugged me so hard my glasses nearly fell off. We're so proud of you. Those words hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, all the resentment, all the hurt, all the years of feeling overlooked seemed to dissolve. This was it. This was the moment. The moment they finally saw me. Really saw me. My mom immediately started talking about celebration plans. Dinner out. Maybe invite grandma over. My dad kept rereading the scholarship details, shaking his head in disbelief. I remember standing there in the middle of my room thinking, finally. And then Jason called. Even now, writing this years later, I can still hear the ringtone. The exact sound that had interrupted so many important moments in my life. My father glanced at his phone. His smile vanished. Jason. Everything shifted instantly. He answered. Listened for less than 10 seconds. And his face went white. What happened? My stomach dropped. I already knew. Not the details. Just the pattern. The celebration was over. Jason had crashed his car. Drunk driving. No one else had been hurt, thank God, but he'd wrapped his Honda around a streetlight and been taken to the hospital for observation. Within 2 minutes, both of my parents were grabbing coats. My mother kissed my forehead distractedly. We'll celebrate properly tonight, sweetheart. My dad squeezed my shoulder. We're so proud of you. And then they were gone. Just like that. The house fell silent. I stood alone in my bedroom doorway staring at the laptop screen. The congratulations email still glowing brightly. The scholarship details. The future I had worked so hard for. And all I could think was, of course. I sat down on my bed and stared at that email for nearly an hour. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt numb. Because once again, Jason had become the gravitational center of our family universe. And everything else, including the biggest achievement of my life, had been pulled into his orbit. That night, I didn't wait up. I went to bed before my parents came home. The next morning, there was a note on the kitchen counter. We're so sorry last night got interrupted. Dinner tonight. We love you. I threw it away. At the time, I told myself I was justified. Now I think about how exhausted they must have been. How terrified. How desperately they were trying to hold together a family that felt like it was splitting apart. And I ache for all of us. Because none of us understood each other then. Not really. That summer passed in a blur of graduation parties, scholarship paperwork, dorm shopping, and increasingly tense silence between me and my family. Not open hostility. Nothing dramatic. Just distance. I withdrew emotionally. Stopped sharing things. Stopped trying. Felt safer that way. If I expected nothing, I couldn't be disappointed. My parents noticed, of course. I could tell they did. My mom would linger in my doorway sometimes, as if she wanted to ask what was wrong but didn't know how. My dad made awkward attempts at conversation over dinner. Jason mostly avoided me altogether, and I interpreted all of it through the lens I'd already built. Too little too late. They only noticed because I was leaving, because they were about to lose the child who had always quietly stayed in line. By August I was counting down the days. College wasn't just education. It was escape. A chance to finally stop orbiting Jason's chaos. A chance to become someone entirely separate from my family. The morning my parents drove me to campus was bright and painfully beautiful. One of those late summer days where everything feels too vivid, too cinematic, as if life knows a chapter is ending. The drive was 3 hours. Mostly quiet. My mom kept making little comments about practical things. Did you remember extra chargers? Call if you need anything. Your dorm probably gets cold at night. My dad gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual. Neither of them said much. At the time, I interpreted their silence as emotional distance. Discomfort. Now I know better. They were trying not to cry. When we finally pulled up to campus, the whole place buzzed with move-in energy. Parents unloading boxes. Students pretending not to look terrified. Orientation volunteers shouting directions. It felt electric. Like possibility. We carried everything up to my dorm room. Made awkward small talk with my new roommate. Helped make my bed. Arranged desk supplies. Normal parent stuff. And then came goodbye. My mother hugged me first. Tightly. Too tightly. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet. Call us okay? I nodded stiffly. Then my father stepped forward. My dad was not a crier. In my entire life I had never once seen him cry. Not at funerals. Not during sad movies. Not even when his own father died. But standing there in my tiny dorm room, his eyes filled. His voice cracked. We love you so much, Em. I remember feeling oddly uncomfortable. Almost suspicious. Why so emotional now? Where was this intensity all those years I needed it? I hugged him back, but not fully. Not warmly. And when they finally walked away, I closed the door and leaned against it. Feeling strangely hollow. At the time I told myself I was relieved. Independent. Free. But deep down I think part of me was devastated. Because even then some wounded part of me still wanted to believe they'd turn around. Come back. Fight harder somehow. Prove I mattered enough. They didn't. And I took that as confirmation. Another piece of evidence. Another brick in the wall. College changed me. Or maybe it simply gave me space to become who I had always been trying to become. Without Jason's constant crises dominating the emotional atmosphere, I thrived. Academically, socially, professionally. I overloaded credits. Joined organizations. Built relationships with professors. Worked part-time at the campus bookstore. Applied for every competitive opportunity one could find. I was relentless. My friends used to joke that I operated like a machine. They weren't entirely wrong. Achievement had become addictive. Because every success temporarily quieted the old voice in my head. The one whispering, still not enough. Still not enough. Phone calls home became increasingly superficial. My parents always asked thoughtful questions. How were classes? How was work? Was I eating enough? Sleeping enough? Did I need money? And I always answered politely. Briefly. Then redirected. How's Jason? The answer was never good. There was always some new issue. Dropped classes. Missed rent. Another failed attempt at sobriety. Another girlfriend gone. Another late-night crisis. And every update reinforced the narrative I'd spent years building. There they go again. Still cleaning up his messes. Still choosing him. Freshman year was especially bad. I noticed my parents sounded distracted on calls. Exhausted. Sometimes my mom's voice sounded strained, like she'd been crying. When I asked what was wrong, she always brushed it off. Just tired. I assumed she was drained from dealing with Jason. And instead of concern, I felt resentment. How twisted is that? I heard exhaustion in my mother's voice and felt angry. Because I thought she was exhausting herself for him by choice. I didn't know then what was really happening. I wouldn't learn the truth for years. And when I finally did, that memory would haunt me. By senior year, I had become exactly the kind of person 18-year-old me had wanted to be. Accomplished. Independent. Impressive on paper. I'd built a resume strong enough to compete for elite international internships. And when I got offered a year-long policy research position in Berlin, it felt like the ultimate validation. It was prestigious, competitive, the kind of opportunity people built careers from. When I told my parents, they were ecstatic. My mom cried. She always cried when I reached major milestones. At the time, I found it vaguely irritating, like emotional overcompensation. Now I understand those tears differently. My father immediately started researching international banking logistics and travel insurance. My mother sent me articles about adjusting to German culture. They helped me prepare in every possible way. And still, I interpreted their support through my old bitterness. It felt too easy, too calm. No dramatic resistance. No visible heartbreak about me moving across the world. Part of me wanted them to struggle with it, to need me enough for it to hurt. Instead, they simply supported me, encouraged me, believed in me. At the time, that felt suspiciously like indifference. Looking back, I realize how distorted my thinking had become. I had started interpreting healthy parental trust as emotional neglect, because I had spent so long equating visible panic with love. Jason got panic. Jason got urgency. Jason got desperation. I got confidence, trust, space. And because I was still seeing everything through wounded eyes, I thought that meant less. I was so wrong. But I didn't know that yet. So in January 2020, I boarded a plane to Germany, convinced I was finally beginning the life I'd built for myself. A life beyond my family. Beyond Jason. Beyond all the old resentment. I remember standing in the airport terminal before boarding, my parents hugging me goodbye. My mother clinging a little too long. My father clearing his throat repeatedly like he was trying to steady himself. "Call when you land," he said. "I will." "We're proud of you," my mom whispered. "Love you." "Love you too," I replied automatically. And then I walked away. I didn't look back. I thought I was stepping into freedom. I had no idea I was walking straight toward the moment that would force me to confront everything I'd misunderstood about my family. But as less than 3 months later, the world would shut down. And for the first time in my life, I would become the child who needed saving. The first 6 weeks in Berlin were everything I had hoped for. Actually, that's not true. They were better. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was living inside the version of myself I had spent years trying to create. Independent, capable, respected, important. The city itself felt alive in a way nowhere else ever had. Everything moved with this effortless confidence. The trains ran with mechanical precision. People walked fast, spoke directly, carried themselves like they had somewhere meaningful to be. I loved that. There was something deeply comforting about being surrounded by ambition, by movement, by purpose. My apartment was tiny. A narrow 4th-floor studio with slanted ceilings and radiators that clanged loudly enough to wake me up most mornings. The shower pressure was terrible. The kitchen was barely bigger than a closet. And I adored every inch of it. It was mine. My first real space in another country. Proof that I had made it. The internship itself was intense but exhilarating. I worked at a policy research institute focused on international economic stability. The work was demanding. Long hours. Dense reports. Complex data modeling. Meetings where I often felt like the least qualified person in the room. And I loved every second of it. For once, all those years of pushing myself felt worth it. Every late-night study session. Every sacrificed weekend. Every anxious exam. It had all led here. To this. The life I had fought for. I called home once a week. Usually Sundays. The conversations were polite. Predictable. My mom always asked if I was eating enough. My dad asked about my projects. And inevitably I'd ask, "How's Jason?" The answers were cautiously optimistic. "He's doing better. He's staying sober. He started therapy again." I remember feeling skeptical. Jason had been doing better so many times before. So I kept my doubts to myself. Distance had made it easier to remain detached. Whatever was happening back home no longer felt like it belonged to me. For the first time, my life felt fully my own. And then, slowly at first, the news started changing. There were murmurs of a virus. A few reports. A handful of cases. Nothing alarming. Not yet. People at work discussed it casually over coffee. Something happening elsewhere. Something temporary. Manageable. She answered on the second ring. "Emily." The moment I heard her voice, something inside me collapsed. I started crying. Not graceful tears. Not quiet ones. Full body sobbing. The kind that steals language. For several seconds I couldn't speak. My mother's voice sharpened instantly. Emily? What's wrong? I don't know what to do, I choked out. There was a pause. A tiny pause. And then she said 3 words that changed everything. We've got you. Her voice was steady. Certain. Absolute. No hesitation. No frustration. No disappointment. Just immediate certainty. Behind her I heard movement. A chair scraping. My father's muffled voice asking what was happening. Then my mother again. Your dad's here. We're figuring this out right now. I tried to protest. To explain. To minimize. But she cut me off gently. No. Listen to me. You are not alone. Do you understand? I started crying harder. Because for the first time in days, maybe weeks, I believed it. What happened over the next 10 days still feels almost impossible when I think about it. My parents became relentless. My mother transformed into a logistical machine. She called the embassy multiple times a day, tracked every update, documented every conversation, joined online groups for stranded Americans, cross-referenced information obsessively. She barely slept. My father attacked the problem from another angle. Over 30 years working in logistics had left him with connections everywhere. My parents insisted I come straight home. No argument. No discussion. The world was too uncertain, they said. Too unstable. And besides, I no longer had an apartment waiting for me. I had let my previous lease expire before leaving for Germany, fully expecting to spend the next year abroad. At the time it had felt like a confident, adult decision. Now it just meant I had nowhere else to go. Some stubborn part of me initially resisted. Even after everything they'd done to get me back, old habits die hard. I didn't want to feel dependent. Didn't want to slide backward into the version of myself that still quietly measured every act of parental support against Jason's endless history of needing rescue. But I was exhausted. Emotionally. Physically. Financially. And if I was being completely honest, there was another reason I agreed so quickly. Relief. Deep, overwhelming relief. Because after weeks of uncertainty, all I wanted was somewhere safe. Somewhere familiar. Somewhere I could stop pretending to have everything under control. Even sitting still, he somehow felt in motion. But this version of him seemed grounded. Calmer. Present. He hugged me tightly when he arrived. Glad you made it home. There was genuine warmth in his voice. No sarcasm. No forced awkwardness. Just sincerity. Dinner itself was strangely normal. Easy even. We talked about Berlin. About the insanity of the pandemic. About Netflix shows and ridiculous quarantine hobbies. At one point my dad laughed so hard at something Jason said that he nearly spilled his drink. And I found myself staring. Not because it was unusual for them to laugh together. But because I was suddenly noticing how carefully my parents watched him. Subtle things. The way my mom's eyes flicked toward him whenever he excused himself from the table. The slight tension in my dad's shoulders whenever Jason was quiet too long. It was almost imperceptible. But once I noticed it, I couldn't stop seeing it. There was vigilance there. A kind of quiet alertness. Not indulgence. Not favoritism. Fear. The realization unsettled me deeply. Because fear was not part of the narrative I had constructed. In my version of events, they doted on him because they preferred him. Because he was their chosen child. Fear complicated that story. Fear suggested something else entirely. Something I wasn't yet ready to understand. After dinner, Jason and I ended up on the back porch while our parents cleaned up inside. It was one of those early summer evenings where the air feels heavy and warm. The kind of night where everything seems to move slower. For a while we sat in silence, listening to crickets, watching the porch light draw moths into frantic little spirals. Then, without looking at me, Jason said, "You always thought they loved me more, didn't you?" My entire body went still. The question hit so directly, so precisely, that for a second I wondered if I'd somehow said it out loud all these years. I stared at him, unable to answer. He gave a small, sad laugh. "Yeah. I figured." "How?" He shrugged. "You weren't exactly subtle." There was no accusation in his voice. Just quiet understanding. And somehow that made it worse. I looked away. Embarrassment flooding through me. because hearing the truth spoken aloud made it feel suddenly childish. Petty. So I managed to ask, was I wrong? Jason was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft I almost missed it. They thought I was going to die. The words landed like physical impact. I turned toward him sharply. What? He still wasn't looking at me. His eyes stayed fixed on the dark yard. And then, slowly, carefully, he began telling me everything. Everything they had hidden. Everything I had never known. The overdoses. Plural. The emergency room visits my parents had disguised as late work nights. The rehab stays I thought were random trips out of town. The hospitalizations. The psych evaluations. The nights my parents sat awake not knowing if their son would survive until morning. And then he told me the part that made my stomach drop. Freshman year. My first semester of college. The period I had always remembered as proof of their distraction. Their emotional absence. The time I felt most certain they cared more about him than me. That was when he had attempted suicide. I physically stopped breathing for a second. What? He finally looked at me. And there was so much shame in his expression it made my chest ache. They found me in time. I couldn't process the words. Freshman year. While I was sitting in my dorm resenting them for distracted phone calls. They had been living through every parent's worst nightmare. Jason swallowed hard. Mom made everyone keep it from you. I stared. Why? His voice cracked. She said you deserved one clean start. One part of your life untouched by my mess. And just like that, the entire structure of resentment I had spent years building began to collapse. Because suddenly, memories I had interpreted as neglect took on horrifying new meaning. The tension in my mother's voice. The exhaustion. The distracted calls. The emotional distance. It hadn't been indifference. It had been survival. And they had hidden their pain to protect me. I sat there frozen, trying to reconcile this truth with everything I thought I knew. Jason rubbed his hands together nervously. Then he said the sentence that shattered me completely. They never loved me more, Emily. They were just trying to keep me alive. And in that moment, everything changed. Everything. Because for the first time I saw my family clearly. And the truth was so much more painful than the lie I had spent years believing. I didn't sleep that night. I tried. I lay in my childhood bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar hum of the air vent, the occasional creak of old floorboards, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Normally those sounds were comforting. That night they felt surreal. Because my entire understanding of my family had just been shattered. I kept replaying Jason's words over and over in my head. They thought I was going to die. The sentence wouldn't leave me. It lodged itself somewhere deep in my chest and stayed there, heavy and immovable. I thought about my freshman year of college. All the moments I had quietly resented my parents. The distracted calls. The way my mother's voice sometimes sounded strained. The way my father occasionally seemed distant when we spoke. The delayed text responses. The missed little details. At the time I had interpreted all of it through one narrow lens. They were consumed by Jason. Always Jason. I remembered sitting on my dorm room floor after one particularly brief phone call with my mom, furious because she had seemed distracted while I was telling her about an academic award I'd won. I remembered hanging up and crying, not because of the award itself but because I felt stupid for still wanting her full attention. I had spent that entire evening spiraling, telling myself the same story I'd been telling for years. No matter what I achieved, it would never matter as much as whatever crisis Jason was causing. And now I knew the truth. That same week, my brother had been in a psychiatric hospital after attempting to end his life. My parents had been sitting in waiting rooms, talking to doctors, trying to hold themselves together while wondering if their son would survive. And somehow, they had still called me, still asked about my classes, still tried to sound normal, still made an effort to be present for me while their world was collapsing. The realization made me physically nauseous. I got out of bed around 3 a.m. and went downstairs for water. The house was dark except for the faint yellow light spilling from under my father's office door. I froze. He was awake. For a moment I considered going back upstairs. But before I could move, the door opened. My dad stepped out looking tired. He stopped when he saw me. Hey. For a second neither of us spoke. Then he noticed my face. The swollen eyes. The obvious evidence that I'd been crying. His expression shifted immediately. Concern. Are you okay? And hearing those words, so simple, so instinctive, nearly broke me. Because there it was again. That immediate, unquestioning care. Not performative. Not conditional. Just automatic. I nodded too quickly. Yeah. Just couldn't sleep. He studied me for a moment. Like he knew there was more. But he didn't push. Instead, he walked into the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and handed it to me. Then he rested one hand lightly on my shoulder. You know you can always talk to us, right? The irony of that sentence hit me so hard I almost laughed. Because for years I had convinced myself that wasn't true. That I existed on the emotional outskirts of this family. That vulnerability was reserved for Jason. And yet here was my father, standing barefoot in the kitchen at 3 a.m, offering exactly the kind of quiet support I had always believed was unavailable to me. I wanted to tell him everything right then. The resentment. The assumptions. The shame. But the words wouldn't come. So I just nodded. And he squeezed my shoulder before heading back to his office. I stood there for several minutes after he left, staring at the dark kitchen. Realizing that maybe, just maybe, I had been seeing only what I expected to see all along. The next morning I found my mother in the backyard tending to her garden. She'd always done that when she was stressed. Something about the repetitive, careful work of pruning and watering seemed to calm her. I stood at the sliding glass door for almost a full minute before stepping outside. She looked up and smiled. Morning, sweetheart. That smile. God, it was so warm. So immediate. And suddenly I couldn't stop wondering how many times she had smiled at me exactly like that while I was too wrapped up in my own hurt to really notice. Can we talk? Her expression shifted instantly. Concern replacing ease. Of course. We sat at the little patio table under the umbrella. For a moment neither of us spoke. The morning air was warm. Birds chattered somewhere in the trees. It felt absurd that something so ordinary could contain something so enormous. Finally I asked, "Why didn't you tell me about Jason?" The question landed heavily between us. My mother went still. Really still. The kind of stillness that only comes when someone is suddenly pulled into painful memory. Her eyes dropped to her hands. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she exhaled slowly. "Did he tell you?" I nodded. She closed her eyes briefly. And when she opened them again there were tears gathering there. Because we didn't want his pain to become yours. I swallowed hard. What does that mean? She looked at me then. Really looked at me. And there was so much love in her expression that it hurt. "Emily." Her voice cracked. We knew how much attention Jason required. We knew how unfair that probably felt sometimes. That sentence alone made my throat tighten. Because hearing her acknowledge it, hearing confirmation that they had seen my hurt even when we never discussed it, was almost unbearable. She continued. We were constantly terrified that his struggles were consuming too much of this family. And when you left for college. She paused. Tears slipping down her face now. We wanted at least one part of your life to be untouched by all of it. I stared at her, trying to absorb what she was saying. You thought protecting me meant not telling me. She nodded. We thought if we could carry it ourselves, then maybe you'd have the freedom to just be young. To focus on your future. To build your life without constantly worrying about what was happening here. I felt tears burning behind my eyes. But I thought you didn't care. The pain that crossed her face is something I will never forget. It was immediate. Raw. Like I had physically hurt her. Oh, sweetheart. She reached across the table and took my hands. Her grip was trembling. We cared so much. Her voice broke entirely then. Sometimes I worried we loved you badly. The words hit me like a punch. Not less. Badly. There's a difference. A devastating difference. Less implies absence. Badly implies effort constrained by impossible circumstances. Human limitation. Exhaustion. Fear. It means the love was always there, just imperfectly expressed. And somehow that hurt even more. Because it meant I had mistaken imperfection for absence. I had looked at parents doing their best under unbearable pressure and decided their love for me must be smaller. The shame of that realization crashed over me all at once. I started crying. Hard. The kind of crying that leaves you breathless. I'm so sorry. The words tumbled out before I could stop them. Over and over. I'm so sorry. My mother stood and wrapped her arms around me. Held me while I sobbed against her shoulder like I was 8 years old again. And through my tears all I could think was, how many times had this comfort been available to me while I sat silently resenting them instead? How many opportunities for understanding had I missed because I was too busy collecting evidence for the story I'd already decided was true? That evening my father joined us in the living room. My mother had clearly told him about our conversation. He sat across from me, his expression serious but gentle. And for the first time in my adult life we talked. Really talked. No surface-level updates. No polite small talk. Just truth. I asked questions I'd spent years too guarded to ask. He answered every single one. Honestly. Without defensiveness. He told me about the night Jason overdosed. How my mother had screamed when she found him. How they'd ridden in the ambulance not knowing if he'd survive. How afterward, they sat in the hospital parking lot and cried for nearly an hour because neither of them knew how to fix what was happening to their son. He told me about the suicide attempt. How he'd driven to the hospital so fast his hands shook too badly to sign intake paperwork. How he had spent that night sitting in a plastic chair outside Jason's room, staring at the wall because if he let himself think too hard he was afraid he'd fall apart. And then he said something that completely undid me. The hardest part, he said quietly, was knowing we still needed to show up for you. I looked up sharply. He continued. We were terrified of failing both of our children at once. I felt my breath catch. He rubbed his hands together, a nervous habit I'd somehow never noticed before. We worried constantly that Jason's crises were stealing too much from your childhood. I could barely speak. Then why didn't you say something? His eyes filled. Because we thought drawing attention to it would make it worse. He swallowed hard. And because, honestly, his voice cracked. We were scared if we acknowledged how much we were asking you to understand, it would confirm how unfair it all was. For a long moment no one spoke. Then my father said something I'll carry with me forever. We trusted you because you were strong, Emily. But we never loved you less for needing less. That sentence healed something in me. Something old and wounded. Because all those years I had interpreted their trust as neglect. Their confidence in me as indifference. When really, it had been exactly what it looked like. Trust. Faith. Belief in my resilience. And for the first time, I understood the tears they cried when they dropped me off at college. The emotion in my mother's voice when I got accepted. The pride in my father's eyes during every graduation and award ceremony. It had all been real. I had just been too hurt to fully receive it. That night, after my parents went to bed, I sat alone in the living room for hours, replaying memory after memory. And slowly, painfully, I began seeing my childhood clearly for the first time. Not through resentment. Not through jealousy. But through truth. And the truth was this. I had never been unloved. Not for a single second. I had simply misunderstood what love looked like when it was fighting a war I couldn't see. Once the truth settled in, I started seeing my entire childhood differently. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't like some dramatic movie montage where suddenly everything became crystal clear. It was slower than that. Messy. More painful. It happened in fragments. Tiny memories resurfacing at random moments, each one reshaping itself under this new understanding. And every single one left me feeling like I had been punched in the chest. A week after that conversation with my parents, I was helping my mom organize old boxes in the basement. It was the kind of tedious task families always promise to do, someday. Years of photographs. School projects. Christmas decorations. Random pieces of life packed into cardboard and forgotten. I was sorting through one dusty box when I found a thick photo album. The cover was faded blue leather. The kind people used before everything became digital. I opened it casually. And froze. It was filled almost entirely with me. Not Jason. Me. Track meets. School plays. Science fairs. Piano recitals. Every major event from my childhood and teenage years. There I was at 9 holding a spelling bee trophy. At 12, grinning in my soccer uniform. At 15, standing beside my Girl Scout Gold Award project. At 18, cap and gown on graduation day. Page after page. Photo after photo. Meticulously organized. Carefully labeled in my mother's handwriting. Little notes beneath many of them. Emily's first solo performance. She was so nervous but did beautifully. Regional track finals she pushed through despite being sick. Could not be prouder. I stared at those words until the letters blurred. Because these weren't the actions of parents who barely noticed their daughter. These were the actions of people who had quietly treasured every accomplishment, preserved every milestone, remembered details I had long forgotten. My mom noticed my silence and looked over. "Oh," she said softly. "I forgot that was in there." I could barely speak. "You kept all of this?" She looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Of course we did." The simplicity of her answer undid me. Of course. To her there had never been any question. No imbalance. No hierarchy. His love. Complicated, imperfectly distributed by circumstance, but love all the same. I turned another page and found a photo from my high school state championship track meet. The one my father had supposedly missed because he'd been out searching for Jason. Except there he was. In the background. Standing near the bleachers. Watching. I stared at the picture in confusion. I thought Dad missed this. My mom came closer. Her face softened. "He got there late." "What?" She nodded. "He spent 4 hours looking for Jason, found him, got him safely to your uncle's house, then drove straight to your meet." I looked at the timestamp printed on the back. The photo had been taken 20 minutes before my race. He made it. My throat tightened. He wouldn't have missed it. The room tilted. For years I had carried that memory as proof. Proof that Jason always came first. Proof that my father didn't care enough. And all along he had been there. He had moved mountains to make both things happen. And because he arrived quietly, without fanfare, without demanding credit, I had never even noticed. I sat down hard on the basement floor and cried. Right there between old holiday decorations and boxes of childhood trophies. Because that was the moment I fully understood just how deeply my own assumptions had distorted reality. I hadn't just misunderstood isolated events. I had rewritten my entire history. Over the next few weeks, more truths surfaced. Some through conversation. Some through memory. Some through details I had never bothered to notice before. Jason and I talked more than we ever had in our entire lives. For most of our childhood we had existed in quiet opposition. Not openly hostile. Just emotionally distant. He represented everything I resented. And I represented everything he probably felt he could never become. But now, with the old narrative collapsing, we were finally able to speak honestly. One night we sat in the garage drinking cheap beer while rain hammered the roof. And he told me things I never imagined hearing from him. "I used to hate you." I looked over, startled. He gave a humorless laugh. "Not really hate. More like resent." I frowned. "Why?" "Because you made everything look easy." The irony hit so hard I almost laughed. He shook his head. "I'm serious. You were everything Mom and Dad should have wanted." I stared at him. "Jason, I spent years thinking they loved you more." He looked genuinely stunned. "That's insane." I almost smiled despite myself. "Yeah. I've gathered that." He leaned back against the wall. For a while he just listened to the rain. Then he said quietly, "Do you know how often Dad talked about you when I was in rehab?" I looked at him. "He'd tell people about your grades. Your internships. Your scholarships." Jason's voice was steady, almost thoughtful. "He was so proud of you it was honestly kind of annoying." I laughed through sudden tears. Because I had spent so many years starving for exactly that kind of confirmation. And here it was. Casually delivered by the very person I had spent years envying. Jason glanced at me. "They never compared us to make me feel bad, by the way." "What do you mean?" "They didn't use you as some standard I failed to meet." He looked down at his hands. "They just loved us differently because we needed different things." That sentence stayed with me. Loved us differently because we needed different things. Not more. Not less. Differently. It was such a simple truth. And yet it had taken me nearly 27 years to understand it. As summer turned into fall, life slowly stabilized. I found remote consulting work. Started rebuilding professional momentum. Began planning my next steps. On the surface things looked normal. But internally I was still processing everything. Because realization doesn't erase guilt. If anything, it intensifies it. And my guilt was enormous. I thought constantly about all the silent judgments I had carried. All the coldness. All the emotional distance. All the times my parents had reached toward me and I had quietly withdrawn because I was convinced their love was conditional. The worst part was knowing they had no idea. They had no idea their daughter had spent years believing herself second best. No idea how often I had interpreted their exhaustion as rejection. No idea how deeply I had misunderstood them. And some selfish part of me wondered whether telling them the full truth would only hurt them. Would confessing my resentment relieve my guilt at the expense of theirs? I didn't know. I still don't. There are some apologies so heavy that speaking them risks transferring the burden rather than lifting it. So instead I focused on showing them. Quietly. Consistently. I called more often. Not because I felt obligated. But as I wanted to. I asked my mom about her garden. Asked my dad about work projects. Remembered little details. Started noticing all the ways they had always quietly cared for me. The books my father would leave outside my room because he thought I'd like them. The way my mother still remembered exactly how I took my coffee. The way both of them lit up whenever I talked about future goals. These weren't new behaviors. That was the painful part. They had been there all along. I was simply seeing them clearly for the first time. That Christmas I finally did something I had been building toward for months. I gave them the photograph. It was my college graduation picture. The one where I'm standing between them in my cap and gown. All three of us smiling so widely it almost looks ridiculous. I had it professionally framed. And on the back I wrote, "Thank you for loving both your children through the hardest years, even when one of us couldn't see it." No explicit confession. No detailed explanation. Just enough truth. When my mother read it, her hand flew to her mouth. Tears filled her eyes instantly. My father stared at the words for several seconds before quietly setting the frame down and leaving the room. For a moment I worried I had done something wrong. Then my mom smiled through tears. "He's crying." That made me cry too. A minute later my dad came back, eyes red. He didn't say anything. He just hugged me. And this time I hugged him back without reserve. Without old hesitation. Without emotional armor. Fully. Completely. The way I should have years earlier. And standing there in my parents' living room, wrapped in the arms of the man I had once believed barely noticed me, I felt something inside me finally settle. Not disappear. Some regrets never fully disappear. But settle. Like a long-held tension finally releasing. Because for the first time in my life I understood something that seems so obvious now. Love is not always loud. It is not always dramatic. It is not always equally visible. Sometimes love looks like crisis management. Sometimes it looks like trust. Sometimes it looks like giving one child urgent rescue while quietly believing the other already knows how deeply she is loved. Sometimes it takes nearly losing everything to finally see what was there all along. I spent years believing my parents had chosen my brother over me. The truth was far more painful. And far more beautiful. They weren't choosing him. They were trying to save him. All while loving me in every quiet way they knew how. And I was just too hurt to see it. I spent years believing I was unloved. But I had been loved all along. I was simply too blinded by my own pain to recognize it. And if there's one thing I know now, it's this. Sometimes the strongest child isn't the one who never needed help. Sometimes she's the one who finally learns how to receive the love that was waiting for her all along.